My daughter's husband told me to leave their Thanksgiving table before the turkey was even carved, and my daughter, the little girl I raised by myself for 15 years after her mother passed, looked right at me and said, "Maybe he's right, Dad." What they didn't know was that I had signed the papers on a $1.9 million mineral rights deal that very morning. So I picked up my jacket, said goodbye to my grandkids, and walked out the front door without a single argument. 2 weeks later, I was eating fresh sardines on a terrace overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and I had no plans to come back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Dwight, and I'm 63 years old. Stick with me until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. I grew up on my father's land in West Texas, about 40 miles outside of Midland, 60 acres of caliche scrub brush that never looked like much but had been in our family for 3 generations. When my father died, he left it to me with a note that said, "The land always comes back around, son." I had no idea what that meant at the time. I found out last year. For most of my adult life, I worked as an electrician, commercial, residential, whatever came in. I raised my daughter Rachel alone after her mother lost her fight with cancer when Rachel was 8 years old. We lived carefully, not poor but never careless with money either. I drove used trucks and packed my own lunch and put Rachel through nursing school at Texas Tech without a dime of debt on her end. Every bit of it came from my labor and from making sure I never spent more than I earned. Rachel was everything to me during those years. Sharp, stubborn like her mother, determined in a way that made me proud even when it drove me up a wall. She graduated, got a good job at a hospital in the Dallas area, and met Kent about 6 years ago at some fundraiser. Kent sold luxury real estate in Frisco. Nice suits, nice car, liked to talk about interest rates and square footage at dinner. He wasn't a bad man exactly. He was just a man who had always been comfortable and had very little understanding of people who hadn't been. When they got married, I sold my house in Midland and moved up to the Metroplex to be close to them and the grandkids. I bought a small place nearby, 2 bedrooms off the highway, a garage where I could work on projects. I thought being close to family would fill up the years ahead of me. What I didn't understand then was that in Kent's world, a retired electrician driving a 10-year-old Ford pickup was a certain kind of person, tolerable at holidays, useful in small manageable doses, but not quite belonging at the table. The first time I really felt it was at a dinner party they threw for some of his colleagues. I showed up in my cleanest jeans and a button-down, not realizing it was a blazer situation. Kent introduced me to his friends as Rachel's dad, without a last name, the way you introduce a distant cousin you're obligated to include. I drove home early that night and told myself I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. Over the next 2 years, my Sunday visits started running shorter. Kent would find reasons to wrap things up. A work call, the kids were tired, a prior commitment. Rachel would give me an apologetic look from across the room but never said anything to him. Not once, not in front of me. Last spring, Kent pulled me aside on the back porch and told me he thought I was visiting a little too frequently for everyone's schedule. He said it pleasantly, like he was doing me a favor. I drove home and sat in my garage for 2 hours staring at the wall. What Kent didn't know, what nobody in that family knew, was that 4 months earlier, a land company out of Houston had contacted me about the mineral rights on my father's 60 acres. A newer seismic survey had confirmed what people in that part of Texas had always suspected might be sitting underneath all that scrubland. They wanted access, and the number they put on the table made my coffee go cold when I read it. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't tell anyone. I had learned enough in 63 years to understand that money changes the way people see you, and I wanted to know who was seeing me clearly while I still had the chance. I hired a land attorney out of Lubbock and negotiated for 4 months. On the morning of the 3rd Thursday in November, Thanksgiving, I sat at my kitchen table and signed a contract worth $1.9 million. Then I put on my jacket and drove to my daughter's house for dinner. I should have turned around in the driveway. The way Kent answered the door told me everything. He glanced past me toward the street before he even said hello, checking whether I'd brought something that needed carrying. When he saw I'd just brought myself, his expression settled into that particular neutrality I had come to recognize. The grandkids came barreling at me from the living room, and for a few minutes everything felt almost normal. I sat on the floor with them and looked at a picture book about dinosaurs and felt genuinely glad I had come. Then Kent called everyone to the table. We were 8 people. His parents had driven in from Plano. A couple of his work friends were there with their wives, then Rachel, me, and the kids. My spot was at the far end, near the children. Kent stood at the head with the carving knife and gave a little speech about gratitude and abundance, and I watched my daughter laugh at something his mother said, and I thought, she looks happy. That matters. That's what I was thinking when Kent said it. His work friend made a comment about the house renovation, and Kent launched into everything they'd updated. New floors, custom cabinetry, the expanded back deck. It all really came together this year, he said. Then he looked right at me and added, Dad was going to help with some of the electrical work, but, well, he gave a small amused shrug. We ended up going with a professional. The table laughed, brief and polite. One of his friends said, smart move. I sat very still. Rachel was looking at her plate. Kent, I said his name quietly. He met my eyes. What? I'm just saying we hired someone with the right licenses, Dwight. No offense. He picked up the carving knife. Honestly, Dad, you've mentioned coming to help a few times, and I think Rachel and I both feel like it creates a certain expectation of access that gets complicated. He was using the word dad like a tool. Every time he said it, he made it sound like something you'd set out on the curb. I looked at Rachel. Maybe he's right, Dad, she said. Her voice was quiet. She would not meet my eyes. That was the sentence. That was the one that settled into my chest and didn't move. I looked at Kent, who was carving the turkey like a man who had just finished settling something that needed to be settled. I looked at his parents, who were very deliberately reaching for the breadbasket. I looked at my grandkids, mercifully oblivious, arguing over a dinner roll. Then I pushed back my chair and stood up. I walked around the table and kissed the top of each grandchild's head. I told them I loved them. I told Rachel I hoped she had a good evening. I shook Kent's hand because that is who I am, and I walked out the front door. I sat in my truck in their driveway for 4 minutes. Then I drove home. That night I did not cry, which surprised me. I heated up a can of soup and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and I thought about my father and about 35 years of wiring other people's houses, working in cramped crawl spaces and August attics and frozen December job sites. I thought about Rachel at 8 years old sitting in a hospital hallway with her knees pulled up, and me sitting next to her not knowing what to say, but knowing I would be whatever she needed for as long as she needed it. I went out to my garage. Against the back wall, under a tarp, was a rocking horse I'd been building for my youngest grandchild. Cherry wood, hand-carved. I'd been working on it since March, a little bit every week. It was almost finished, maybe 2 more weekends of sanding and a finish coat. I had planned to give it at Christmas. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I went inside and called my accountant. I had been quietly researching a small walled town in Portugal called Óbidos for the better part of a year. A friend of a friend had retired there and described it as the town that time forgot, in the best possible way. Medieval stone walls, white houses with painted trim, a market twice a week. The kind of place where a man could learn to be still. I had no intention of telling anyone where I was going. The 2 weeks between Thanksgiving and my departure were the most methodical of my life. I arranged for the house to go on the market. My neighbor Norma, who I trusted completely, agreed to act as the point of contact for the listing agent. I donated the furniture I didn't want and shipped 1 crate of belongings ahead to a storage facility near Lisbon. I packed 2 suitcases like a man who had been thinking about this for a long time, because I had been thinking about it for a long time. The rocking horse I left on Norma's porch with a note asking her to deliver it to my grandkids in January. I canceled my local cell service. I left no forwarding address. If I was as peripheral to their life as that Thanksgiving table had suggested, it seemed only honest to make it official. Rachel noticed on a Sunday, when her text got no reply, she assumed I was giving things time to cool off after the dinner. That was fair. She knew what Kent had said. She'd been there. But the second Sunday came and went, then the third. She drove to my house on a Tuesday and found the lockbox of a real estate listing on the front door. She called my number and got the disconnection message. She called Norma, who gave her the listing agent's name but honestly told her she didn't know where I had gone. And that part was true, because I hadn't told Norma. I had only told Norma I was leaving. What I didn't know at the time was that Rachel drove to my house a second time and, finding the garage unlocked, walked inside. The rocking horse was gone, but the workbench was still there, and on the pegboard above it, still hanging where I'd put them years ago, were a dozen photographs I'd printed and thumbtacked up to keep me company while I worked. Rachel's nursing school graduation. The kids on their first days of school. A birthday party. A picture of Rachel and her mother, taken maybe a year before her mother got sick, both of them squinting into the sun at some lake. Rachel stood in my cold garage looking at those photographs for God knows how long. Her husband told her I would turn up eventually, that I was probably sulking, that this was the kind of drama older people created when they felt overlooked. She did not push back on that, not right away. But I know my daughter. Something in her would have registered even then that what Kent was describing and what those photographs represented were two entirely different things. She found out about the money through my cousin Merle, which is the kind of irony that could only happen in a family like ours, because Merle is the biggest gossip in 4 counties of West Texas. He'd heard through the land company's local rep about the deal, put 2 and 2 together, and called Rachel's cousin, who called Rachel. She drove to Merle's place in Midland the following weekend, and he confirmed everything: the land, the company, the figure. She sat in his kitchen and didn't say a word for a full minute, which Merle said frightened him more than if she'd screamed. $1.9 million. Her father, the man she had let sit at the end of a Thanksgiving table, while her husband implied he was incompetent and overstaying his welcome, had signed that deal the same morning he showed up for dinner and walked out without saying a single word about it. On the drive back to Frisco, she called Kent and told him what she'd found. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Well, that explains why he was so calm about leaving." That sentence, Kent's first instinct going straight to the money rather than to the man, was apparently the thing that finally broke something open in my daughter. She told me later that she pulled into a gas station off I-20, sat in her car, and wept in a way she hadn't wept since she was 8 years old in a hospital hallway. She booked a flight to Lisbon 10 days later. It took her another week to find me. A woman at a small guest house in Obidos had seen me at the Tuesday market and described me to Rachel. Older American, quiet, bought too many oranges, was attempting Portuguese with more enthusiasm than accuracy. That was enough. She knocked on my door on a Thursday morning. I had just come back from the bakery with bread still warm from the oven. I was in my slippers. I had a Portuguese language workbook open on the kitchen table. When I opened the door and saw her standing there with a rolling suitcase and circles under her eyes, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the particular ache of looking at someone you love who has caused you genuine pain, and knowing that both things are equally true at the same time. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. She burst into tears on my doorstep. We sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours that first morning, then walked to a cafe near the town wall, where they already knew my order, and sat there for 2 more. Rachel asked me why I hadn't told them about the money. I told her the truth. I had wanted to know whether my family wanted me around before they knew I had anything to offer besides myself. She flinched at that. I let her. She told me what Kent had been like after I left, how he'd barely seemed to register my absence except as a minor inconvenience. She told me about finding those photographs in my garage. She told me she'd gone through every photo of me on her phone and counted 7, and most of them were from holidays when she'd needed someone to photograph the whole group. "I think I've been a bad daughter," she said. "I think you've been a daughter who got comfortable," I told her. "That's different." She asked what the difference was. "A bad daughter doesn't fly across an ocean to sit in a cafe in Portugal," I said. We were quiet for a while. Outside, a couple of old men were playing cards at another table. A cat was sleeping on the wall in the sun. Church bells came from somewhere down the hill. "Are you coming home?" she asked. I looked out at the white houses on the hillside, at the medieval wall that had stood for 7 centuries, at the geraniums hanging from a window 3 buildings over. I thought about the market on Tuesday mornings, and the old man who ran the hardware shop, and was teaching me the Portuguese names for tools. I thought about the small group of expats and locals who gathered on Friday evenings at a wine bar near the main gate, just to sit together and argue about nothing important. "This is home," I said. "This is where I'm going to stay." She nodded slowly, like she had already known that. "Then I want to come visit," she said. "Not to convince you of anything, just to visit." "Then come visit," I said. That was the conversation. No speeches, no ultimatums. We were never a dramatic family, or hadn't been, until that Thanksgiving. We were 2 people who had let a comfortable distance grow between them, and were now looking at it clearly for the first time. Kent came to Obidos 4 months later, at Rachel's insistence. We had coffee. We were civil. I don't expect a friendship, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. But he was straight with me in a way he hadn't been before, and I was straight with him, and we came to an understanding that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with basic respect. That's all I'd hoped for, and it was enough. The rocking horse reached my grandchildren in January, right on schedule. Rachel sent me a video of the youngest riding it, her feet barely touching the floor, laughing like the world had been arranged just for her. I watched that video 4 times the day it came in. I video call Rachel every Sunday now, not out of obligation but because I look forward to it. She tells me about her week, I tell her about my latest attempt to order coffee without embarrassing myself, and we laugh the way we hadn't laughed together in years. The grandkids call me on random Tuesday afternoons to show me things, a drawing, a bug they found, whatever the emergency of the day is. I answer every time. The money sits mostly in managed accounts. I live simply here, rent on a modest house, food from the market, a few things that genuinely matter to me. I've given some of it away to causes I believe in. I'm learning to paint watercolors badly, which gives me more pleasure than I can easily explain. Someone in town asked me recently what I would tell my younger self if I could go back. I thought about that for a while. A man can spend his whole life being useful to people, wiring their houses, showing up every Sunday, fixing whatever needs fixing without being asked. And somewhere in all that usefulness, he can forget to ask himself whether he's actually wanted or just needed. The two things feel the same from the inside until suddenly they don't. I learned the difference at 63, standing in a cold garage in Texas, looking at a half-finished rocking horse. It was, all things considered, not too late. Now I want to ask you, what would you do if you were in my position? Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have, out of love or habit or obligation? Leave a comment below, and while you're thinking about it, I've got 2 more stories waiting for you on the end screen. Thank you for staying with me until here.